Sarah, are we ready to go?
We will be in about 10 seconds.
Perfect.
You're good.
Great. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Unique, Unified, Universal, Excavating Unicode's Role in the Multilingual Digital Sphere. My name is Dr. Isabelle Zaugg, and I want to welcome everyone here today, our guests, our panelists, and I want to do a really brief introduction to kind of converge on this topic that we're investigating before we launch into our panel presentations. We're here to discuss a critical but understudied piece of digital infrastructure, the Unicode Standard. And today, Unicode is most popularly recognized for defining new emoji, but its primary task is far more vast and essential than that. The Unicode Standard was created in 1991 to set rules or codes to map onto every letter of every writing system so that every machine that followed the Unicode Standard could reliably exchange multilingual text. Like any other technical system, Unicode is built and run by interested social actors, in this case, the Unicode Consortium, an American nonprofit with membership composed of big tech companies, other nonprofits, and even ordinary people drawn to the Unicode project. Our panel today introduces the Unicode project as a subject of scholarly inquiry from a range of disciplinary vantage points. Our panelists probe what makes technical materials so difficult to understand, what work is being done to bridge the interests of technical actors and user communities, and what resources does this require? What motivates these boundary actors in the realm of writing systems? And how are peripheral communities in the Global South assigning meaning to and negotiating with these standards? It's my honor to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dr. Anshaman Pandi, who is data scientist and writing systems specialist, a lead for data management and analytics at a Chicago financial technologies firm, but who builds out the Unicode Standard in his spare time, often in collaboration with the Script Encoding Initiative. He is the winner of the Unicode Bulldog Award and has a PhD in history from the University of Michigan. Dr. Keith Murphy is Associate Professor of Anthropology at UC Irvine. He researches language interaction and design in Sweden and the US. Anushah Hossain is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. She uses historical and ethnographic methods to study the intersection of language, technology, and identity. I myself am a communication scholar bridging Columbia University's Data Science Institute and the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society, who we'd very much like to thank today for hosting our event, along with our co-sponsors. In addition to my research on language justice in the digital sphere, I develop and support innovations in transdisciplinary data science education through leadership of the Collaboratory at Columbia, as well as the NIH-funded Afria DST project, advancing public health research in Eastern Africa through data science training. So with no further ado, I would like to thank Keith Murphy for your upcoming presentation. Oh, excuse me. My mistake. We're going to start with Dr. Anshuman Pandi. Thank you so much, and we look forward to learning from your presentation.
All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Isabelle. Let's get right into it. My talk today is called Unique and Unruly, Meeting the Demand for Encoding Newly Invented Scripts in Unicode. Oh, let me see how I need to drop this. Okay. So the synopsis of my talk is focused on, or my talk is focused on, how does Unicode handle a surprising barrage of requests for newly invented scripts. We've identified a phenomenon whereby the number of writing systems that have been created in South Asia have increased since the turn of the 20th century. Now, the users of these scripts wish to communicate in the scripts on digital devices, but in order to do so, these scripts must be encoded in the Unicode standard. However, at this time, while we have encoded several of these newly invented writing systems, or what we call neographies, there are no clear guidelines for assessing such scripts or to determine how many of these scripts are viable and should be in the standard. So these are the key talking points I'll be addressing today. So a little bit about me, just to fill in where Isabelle left off. I have a background in history and linguistics, and I currently spend most of my time doing data management and analytics for a fintech firm here in Chicago. With regard to Unicode, however, I have been working very closely with the Script Encoding Initiative and Dr. Deborah Anderson, the director, to identify and to add into Unicode several historical and minority scripts. I was granted the Bulldog Award in 2011 for my work on several of these writing systems. And since then, I've been provided with funds from the Adopt a Character program to continue my work, which has led me to encode, as of right now, 28 scripts, 4 number systems, 4 emoji, and a handful of various characters for various other scripts. And in close collaboration with Deborah Anderson and SEI, I'm working on including another additional 50 scripts in the Unicode Standard. Down here are the 4 emoji that I was lucky enough to get into the standard. So my work on digital language enablement is driven primarily by my love and my desire for the representation of visible language. And I use that term to mean script or writing system, or what we just call generically in English, an alphabet. And in my opinion, visible language or writing systems is a topic that is often ignored in traditional and applied linguistics and language studies. The preference is always on the spoken as opposed to the written. And I'm also driven by my love for data management and analytics, and want to be able to provide access to individuals for exchanging and presentation of textual information. I have been working over the years on enabling users to input, search, and to view text uniformly on devices by designing and developing input methods, and also working on natural language processing and machine learning libraries for information extraction on lesser resource languages. And I do this all for the goal that I have in mind, which is my pie in the sky dream, is that what if on digital media and digital devices, what if all languages were treated as digitally native as English is? So my motivation, kind of tying in with the theme of this panel, is to provide universal access for people to interact with visible language and information across all digital platforms by unifying my work on writing systems, linguistics, standardization, and data management to build out the unique intersection of technology and humanities that is Unicode. So speaking of that, what is Unicode? So Unicode is fundamentally a standard for the exchange of data. And the data we're talking about here is encoded characters. So it basically is an international standard for writing systems. And it has, in the past 30 years, transformed the way in which we use language, in which we communicate around the globe, and in which we conduct scholarship and drive out policy related to language and digital language rights. Unicode fundamentally and objectively enables the uniform storage and exchange of digital text, from being able to capture textual content in plain text in the original writing system, and to exchange that across computer platforms and operating systems in the same way that the user intended it for it to be viewed by others. And as of version 14, Unicode has a total of 145,000 characters, which can be spread across about 160 scripts. So the script in Unicode is a amorphous concept, but we can identify some basic attributes for it. So for our purposes here, a script is a sign system with defined rules and meaning. And it is constituted by distinctive characters such as letters, digits, punctuation, signs, and symbols. And each of those characters possesses a unique semantic value that ultimately is assigned a unique hexadecimal value or a unique code or Unicode that software can recognize and process appropriately across all systems and devices. Now, Unicode is fundamentally ordered by something that we call the character glyph model. And Keith and Anushah will speak to you in more detail about this model with regard to their own particular cases. But I just want to point out something that's very important, and that is, at top, we have basic distinctive signs that belong to the Latin script for English. And below, we have variant shapes of these signs. So we have a cursive A, we have a curly QA, and at the very, very bottom, we have these fanciful other forms of the basic letters. In Unicode, according to the character glyph model, all of these are variants or expressions of a base letter A, which is assigned a unique code of 0041 in Unicode and a name, Latin capital letter A. And that 0041 maps to the binary code 10101. So that is fundamentally what Unicode does. It assigns a hexadecimal / binary unique number to every letter in the standard so that every character can be identified uniquely using both a binary, a hexadecimal, and also a human readable character name. Now, Unicode has provided unprecedented opportunities for minority language communities and for also historical scripts that are used by scholars. Now, one of these is the ability for users of minority languages to maybe for the first time on a digital platform to access information and to communicate with their community members using a script and language that is intrinsically familiar to them. Now, previous to Unicode, people would have to go and develop costly software and language-specific software and ensure that people copy software and install programs across a multitude of platforms. But Unicode has reduced the cost of developing content, primarily because there's a huge open source community that supports and enables the proliferation of Unicode technologies and standard across devices. Unicode also, through that mechanism of providing libraries and providing a standard, it has led to the preservation and promotion of linguistic diversity throughout the globe. And it has also enabled nations across the world to implement some sort of digital governance that allows for the fostering of linguistic plurality so that people don't have to choose in a resource constrained country, choose to provide developmental support for language A versus language B when they can say, okay, you know what, we've cut out the technological impediments to linguistic support through the help of Unicode, so now we can maybe spread the wealth around a little better. And it allows for facilitation of standard communication in non-standard languages, kind of pointing back to the governance and the promotion of linguistic diversity. And in a way, it also, through the fact that the script is standardized and codified in an international standard, Unicode also serves to provide a layer of protection for linguistic and also textual assets. If you go to the Script Encoding Initiative website, you will see that there are several scripts that have been encoded, but up to 100 scripts that have not yet been encoded. And this is a list of some of those. And Isabelle will speak to you more about the role of SCI in the encoding of scripts within the Unicode world. Now, this is the meat that I want to get to, the newly amended scripts of South Asia. So since the beginning of the 20th century, various communities in India have been creating writing systems to express not only their cultural, but also their linguistic, and also in certain cases, their religious identities. And the question I want to pose here, and there's no clear answer to it, is what could be driving the phenomenon of neographies? Now, certainly this will point to reactions to colonialism, reactions to majoritarian language influence within certain regions of South Asia. But this term here, neography, is one that a former director of Unicode has invented, and that is a portmanteau of neo and graphy, neography meaning new writing, similar to words such as orthography. So neographies in South Asia here, just a quick historical context. So in a sense, we can consider that South Asia has been a site of continuous writing system development since either the Indus Valley civilization, depending on your point of view, going back to the 3rd century BCE or 3rd millennium BCE, or a little more tangible if you want to base your opinions on archaeological evidence, going back to at least the 2nd century BCE with the pillars put up by Ashoka. So since that time, from Brahmi, we have a proliferation of organic scripts of South Asia that have also made their way into Central Asia, etc., leading to very common scripts that we are familiar with across South Asia and also in other parts of the world. Now here we have example of Devanagari, Tamil, Bengali, and Sinhala. There are other scripts that are within the South Asian linguistic sphere, and you see I've crossed out that family tree there. And these scripts are primarily an indigenous creation. And they are, for the most part, genetically unrelated to other scripts, even though they may be inspired by shapes and by structures. And that means that an individual has identified that his language or her language has a set of phonemes, and they have assigned a particular visible symbol that represents that sign. And that sign may be inspired by another script, or it may be an entirely new invention that stems from the mind of the creator. So in South Asia, there are 3 classical South Asian neographies. These are Old Chiki, Wurang Chiti, and Sora Sompeng. And you see here that apparently Windows does not support Wurang Chiti yet. So that's a lapse on Microsoft's part. And these are the 3 classic, or basically, let's say, canonical invented scripts of South Asia that people are familiar with and people have studied. Now, there are others, and I'll get to those in a second, but Old Chiki was developed by Raghunath Murmu in 1925 for Santali, which is the Munda language. And the idea was to provide a distinctive script that is tied to Santali's relationship to nature. Wurang Chiti was developed by Lako Bodra for writing Ho, another Munda language, in the 1950s, and it was designed as an alternate script to orthographies that were presented to the Ho by Christian missionaries. And here's an example of what the script looks like. And then we have Sora Sompeng that was developed by Mange Gomango in 1936 as a script for writing Sora songs. And here we have a printed form of the script. On the periphery of Burma and India, an individual named Pao Chin Hao developed a syllabary in 1902 for writing Tedim. And his goal was to develop a script that could accurately represent the tones of Tedim, but also that would give the Tedim community a distinctive script that stood apart from the orthography that was presented to them by the Baptist missionaries, and also by the majoritarian Burmese community in that area. So this is a form of the script that he designed. Later on, he modified this into an alphabet, and this was also used for writing Laipian or Tedim songs. And this script has already been encoded in Unicode. Another script is called Masaram script for Gondi, developed by Mangal Singh Masaram. This here, if you're familiar with the Brahmi system, you see that, if you can see this chart, I know that's kind of hard to read, but this was modeled on the Brahmi script with a one-to-one parallel between the Brahmi inventory and the Gondi letter inventories. But he at the same time introduced a very unique structure into the script. And then we also have external neographies. There's a scholar in India named Prasanna Skri, who has designed at least 19 scripts for the indigenous alphabets, indigenous languages of India. And here we have examples of the scripts that she designed for Gondi and for Savara. And her work has been recognized by the Indian Express, where an article published about her work, supposedly entering some world atlas of endangered alphabets, which there is no such thing. This is a project that's run by Tim Brooks called Endangered Alphabets. And Mr. Brooks has mentioned her work, but I don't know of any world atlas. So that leads me to this point here: is what is the motivation for such script creation in South Asia? Some ideas that we might throw around are: it provides a distinctive visual marker for language and community. It provides a community's language with parity with other written languages, particularly those that are the predominant or majoritarian languages in a particular region. And at the same time, it allows for a distinctive separation from other languages. So a member of that community might say, hey, this is my script. It's distinct, it's unique, and it stands separate from your other script. And now, others might be able to view our community as being equally on par in terms of our literacy and our and our linguistic development as other communities around us. Like practically, it allows for the development of a language appropriate orthography, one that is not, let's say, a 26-letter alphabet that's imposed on a language that has, let's say, 52 different phonemes, where you need to repurpose a particular vowel sound or vowel letter for, let's say, 4 or 5 different sounds, as we do for English. And lastly, it also may provide for a little bit of an ego stroke, and that is the tangible expression of a script creator's legacy, both within his community and within the larger region in which he resides. So South Asia neographies, we have encoded several South Asian neographies within Unicode. We have several that are in progress, and 2 that will be included in the next version of Unicode. So the challenge of inventing newly encoded scripts in Unicode is that Deborah Anderson and I have identified several key points that make it difficult for us to number one, identify what these scripts are, like how they're used, and what the model should be for Unicode. And that is getting access to the script creator, if they're still alive, and to the user community. Access to materials. We need to be able to analyze and to parse out and determine rules for how the script works in order to develop an encoding for it. Thirdly, understanding adoption and penetration of script usage. Tied to that is gauging the stability of the script. And then also, what are the motivations for script creation? One of the difficulties when encoding script in Unicode that is a new script is that we are sometimes unsure whether that script is being presented or being created as a political act. Sure, all script creation and all linguistic acts are at some level, and then in the anthropological linguistic sense, they're all speech or political acts. But is this script creation being done in order to create a wedge or drive a wedge or to foment some sort of reaction within the state or region in a particular area? And then also, how many other indigenous scripts or competing scripts are there? So for example, in India, we have a language called Kuruk, and there are at least 2 different scripts that have been put forth for writing the script within the community. And there's still a lot of discussion within the community about which of these 2 scripts would best represent the ideals of the Kuruk speaking Orans. Also within Nepal, the Grung language has at least 5 scripts that have been invented for it. I think practically some researchers have pinned that down to at least 2 that are functional and 1 that is actually used to some extent by the community. But again, like if we were to see this objectively, we would need to find out, which of these 5 scripts is going to be the script that is going to be the winner among the competitors. And if so, or if it is the winner, then what is the likelihood of it being used? We don't want to put a script into Unicode and have it be a relic and sitting there in the standard unused just because we thought that we would be doing a service to language community by taking into consideration their desires to have their own script within the standard. So there's 2 cases that I kind of want to call out here. And these were raised by James Cass on the Unicode mailing list in October of last year. And there are 2 cases here which kind of help us understand a dividing line between or a metric for determining suitability for encoding scripts in encoding neographies in Unicode. So in both these cases, we have a speaker of an indigenous language who has created a new writing system. For case 1, the individual would want it to be in Unicode so that there will be a standard for the script. And once there's a standard for it, the individual can go to the community and say, hey, look, we have a writing system that's been approved by or encoded by an international body. Now let's start using this as our native script. Right? So that's a very proactive way of pushing forward a neography agenda. Case 2 is more of an organic situation where an individual has designed a writing system and he has convinced the community to adopt it, to learn it, and use it to the point where they're publishing books and periodicals in the script. And it has been adopted for use in education, where a new generation of speakers of that language and members of that community are learning the new writing system. And the system has been wholeheartedly embraced by Unicode. I'm sorry, the writing system has been embraced by the community. And so there's a lot of possibility for it to also be adopted by Unicode. Now, in the face of a lack of standardization or lack of normative guidelines for how to handle such scripts, we've determined some guidelines that might help in determining the suitability for encoding neographies. Number one is there a standard form of the script within a particular region? And is that script the primary writing system for a given language? Or is it a secondary script? Let's say, for example, you have within India itself, Devanagari as the primary script for a given language, and then another that may be a secondary or an idealized writing system that is put forth by a community. Does it have institutional support? Like, is there official recognition for that script? Is it used in education? Are members of the community publishing it? Are they trying to find unique ways of exchanging the image or exchanging the script using images in digital media? What's the community sentiment like? Have people develop keyboards, fonts, or other technical resources for it? And lastly, who is requesting the inclusion of the script in Unicode? Is it a particular individual, or is it, let's say, an NGO, or is it, let's say, a state government or the national body itself? So the case study that I want to present here is the Sunuwar script, which, as I mentioned, was recently approved for encoding in Unicode, but that journey was one that took a decade. So back in 2011, when I was doing a lot of research on Neographies in South Asia, I'd come across what I call the Gentia Script, invented by Karna Bahadur Gentish in the 1940s for writing Sunuwar or Koints, which is a Tibeto-Burman language that is spoken in eastern Nepal and parts of Sikkim. And this was an alphabet that was designed and has been used since then in a fairly stable way. It's used for publishing an official newsletter in Sikkim, and it's also used in primary school textbooks and taught to students. And very recently, the community has spent a lot of effort in developing technologies to produce digital content, such as new fonts, keyboards, etc. And then based on all of the new development that's taken place for that script in the last 10 years, the Sunuwar script has met several of the criteria that I previously stated, and I rewrote the proposal with the help of members of that community and a group called Translation Commons in collaboration with SCI to successfully get the Sunuwar script adopted for inclusion in Unicode, and that'll be coming out in the next version of the standard. But just an example of a neography that's been vying for standardization, and through the effort and the effort of the indigenous community with collaboration with global scholars and global institutions, have been able to get their script into the standard. So I know I've taken a lot of time here, but I just want to say there's a lot of work still to be done. Check out SCI's website and find a way to unify your own interest for enabling and for propelling forward the unique contribution that Unicode is to our technical world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anshuman, for your fantastic, very informative presentation. So next up, we have Keith Murphy. His talk today, if I'm not mistaken, is entitled Caring for Writing, and will bring into view the motivations and practices of the people building this digital infrastructure in the context of a physically crumbling world.
Thanks. I changed the title, so it's a little bit different. I think you can see it on my screen. So, so some of what I will talk about, Anshuman very beautifully preceded some of that stuff, but I'll give it a different spin. Since about 2019, I've been conducting an ethnographic project that's mostly focused on the people who make graphic language and make graphic language work. By graphic language, I mean any of the many visual forms that text can take, including typefaces, writing systems, digital fonts, hand lettering, graffiti, and so on. And one of the small moments that drew me to this research was a sudden realization that probably shouldn't have been so sudden, or should have just been known years ago, was the graphic language that I interact with doesn't simply exist for people like me to use as a writer or a reader. There must be actual people who do stuff to make it work. And it turns out that, yeah, that's right. The graphic language that I use works because a distributed group of invisible technicians, as historian Stephen Shapin would call them, invest tremendous energy in making sure that graphic language in the many forms that it takes is usable by as many people as possible. And indeed, if graphic language didn't work or wasn't cared for by the invisible technicians and invisible caretakers who manage it, much of what makes the world run today would, at the very least, function much more anemically or even outright possibly break down. One group of invisible caretakers that I talked to in my research belonged to the Unicode Consortium, which, as we've seen, helps ensure that writing systems, especially non-Latin forms, are able to function properly on digital platforms. These folks were mostly members of the Script Ad Hoc Committee, a subset of the Unicode Technical Committee, which in effect deliberates what scripts and the characters get encoded in the standard and how they get encoded. Over several months, I sat as a shadow participant in Script Ad Hoc Committee meetings, observing how a relatively small collective of experts with deep knowledge of both language and coding figure out how to get writing systems and their component pieces to function properly on digital devices. There are probably as many reasons for why the Script Ad Hoc Committee's work matters as there are characters encoded in Unicode, but here's just one story. In 2021, a woman named Cheyenne Cunningham tried to register the name of her husband's new contracting business with the local government in British Columbia. The name of the company, Koyatsan, means grizzly bear in their ancestral language, Hunkamitnum. But when Cunningham logged in to register the name, her request was denied. As it turns out, the system used by the British Columbia government would only accept the standard set of characters used in English and French writing. The Hunkamitnum orthography Cunningham had tried wasn't even recognized or recognizable by the system. And to be clear, the characters used to write Hunkamitnum are encoded in the Unicode Standard. If they weren't, you wouldn't be able to see them on the screen. But the computer system Cunningham was required to use to register her business wasn't robust enough to handle all of the scripts encoded in Unicode. Now, there are also laws in Canada that mandate using only English and French in business names, and these laws are tied up in Cunningham's case too, but this is mostly just a distraction. For example, Sandvik, the name of a massive mining company in Canada, is a Swedish word, Sandvik, that means sandy bay, but there doesn't seem to be any problem using that Swedish name as a company name. The real problem here isn't about language as such, even though the Canadian government has framed it that way. It's about writing and letters and how to represent the sounds of Indigenous languages. And embedded underneath all of this is a technical infrastructure that allows complex orthography to work. So several decades ago, as we heard, the people behind the Unicode Standard foresaw the need for users of small languages like Hunkamitnum to write their languages on digital platforms, and they built the tools necessary for doing so. Still, when authorities like the Canadian government don't acknowledge and implement these infrastructures in ways that make them actually usable for people who need to use them, then we can start to see all sorts of political, even discriminatory implications unfold, as we can see in this example. Okay, so if the Script Ad Hoc Committee is oriented to addressing situations like those faced by Cheyenne Cunningham, what does their work actually look like? We've seen some of it, but I'm going to give the anthropologist's take on it, an overview of some of this work. So when a person or organization wants to petition for something to be added to the Unicode Standard, anything from a newly discovered character to an entire writing system, they have to submit a proposal with detailed information about the request. And it's not a simple proposal. This is just very small part of just the beginning of the proposal process. The Script Ad Hoc Committee's main task is to evaluate these proposals and make recommendations to the Unicode Technical Committee about how to move forward with the request. What gets deliberated in Script Ad Hoc Committee meetings can vary widely. Let's say, for example, they receive a proposal that requests adding a new letter to an existing widely used writing system. But maybe the letter is only used by a small number of languages and therefore isn't super common, which might explain why it wasn't encoded with the original encoding of the writing system. Issues that the committee might need to determine could include, is this a letter that people actually use? Meaning, is there evidence that it's used by people other than the proposers themselves? What are the character's properties? And this is actually a complicated issue. And if you look at the description of what property means for Unicode, you can see that there's a lot of information that needs to be determined. Properties might mean, what does this letter actually look like? Multiple submissions for the same proposal might include representations of the letter that look noticeably different from one another. So how do you determine which representation to use? If there are differences, do they impact the core form of the letter, or are they stylistic variations that can be handled through fonts? And to show you what I mean by that, think about the uppercase letter Q. As we saw with the A's in Anshuman's presentation, they can be rendered really differently in different fonts. But while there's a lot of difference, the core form, a circle with a crossbar in the lower right portion, more or less, is consistent in all of these examples. So you can see the stylistic as being handled by a font. Compare that with a lowercase a, which actually has two distinct core forms in its printed version, a one-story A and a two-story A that look pretty different. I personally, as a user of these, don't know which one is the more authentic A, and I don't know if anybody does. I mean, people could argue, but I don't know. Many fonts now allow users to choose between the two, and most people probably don't even notice the difference between these as they're reading. But if the Script Ad Hoc Committee is faced with a similar difference with an unfamiliar character, they need to make a decision about which one becomes the proper one. The committee might also need to figure out, what do you name this letter? How do you sort it? Writing systems tend to be ordered in consistent ways, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so on. So if you're adding a new letter, you need to know where to put it. All of this and so much more is what Unicode practice actually entails. It's fine-grained, detail-oriented infrastructure work that builds and maintains the technical grid that supports the digital existence of graphic language. And it provides the capacity for hundreds of languages to be written in ways that their users understand and can take ownership of. And this is where you're gonna forgive me because I have to do a rapid shift in a different direction. Most of the research for this project has been conducted in and around San Francisco and New York. And in these regions, like others in the US and around the world, social and economic inequality has exploded in the 21st century, reaching heights unseen for a very long time, and certainly within my own lifetime. My field work took me to a lot of fancy places, including visits to the offices of giant tech companies you've definitely heard of, and residential neighborhoods noted for their high number of millionaires. At the same time, to get to those places, I rode subway systems that routinely broke down, circumnavigated intersections flooded by burst water pipes, and walked past massive homeless encampments, often just around the corner from my destination. And after months of this, I began to feel a little weird having these deep conversations about the small infrastructures that support fonts and digital text, while the big infrastructures, the social ones and the physical ones, were literally decaying around us. And so rather than just feeling weird about it, I decided to ask the folks I was working with what they thought, how they felt about dedicating so much time and energy to working with something small like letters, when all the big stuff seemed so grim or maybe even so hopeless. So by the summer of 2019, I was regularly asking people to talk about what it's like to work with small letters when it felt like the big stuff was deteriorating. Most of the Unicode folks I asked these questions to demurred in one way or another. But still, it was clear that everyone felt driven, or maybe even called in some instances, to the project of encoding scripts. Most of the people who regularly attend the Script Ad Hoc Committee meetings are there voluntarily. Many work for large tech companies, but these specific individuals work with Unicode and the Script Ad Hoc Committee in particular because they tend to care about language accessibility, not just as a technical problem, and that certainly is something that matters, but also as a social and political one with contingencies that extend over time. As one script ad hoc committee member put it to me, script is an important cultural marker for people. And there's also the concept of transmission. So, as soon as a language switches scripts, they lose connection to previous literature. And that can be very jarring, and that can cause like major cultural changes. And so for that reason, it's actually very important that people are able to use the script of their choice in digital. So it's actually kind of vitally important that all of these things are well supported. And think back to Cheyenne Cunningham, who wanted to register her business with a Hunkameetnam word. She wasn't entirely prevented from participating in the process. She was always able to write the name of her business in Latin script instead of the one used for Hunkameetnam. But there's an abiding sentiment among Unicode folks that to do so is to not use the proper writing system for a given language, but instead to use someone else's, is actually a kind of injustice. That doesn't mean that Unicode folks have stakes in any particular writing system or language or group of people, but they do have a stake in the idea that people should not be kept from full and faithful participation in society because technology that humans design for other humans happens to prevent them from doing so. And here's where I, the struggling anthropologist, have ended up with all of this. It's hard for me to see folks who work with letters, especially those who work with Unicode, as toiling away on small things. Because even though what they do is often small in a literal sense, it's also really important. As I said at the start, the modern world is supported by lots of infrastructures. And when we hear talk of the world falling apart, at least here in the US, we often think about that falling apart in a literal way, through the lens of infrastructural decay. Bridges collapse, apartment buildings crumble, and pipelines carrying petrol get shut down by hackers halfway across the world. But there's another set of infrastructures, of tiny infrastructures like the ones that support graphic language, like the Unicode Standard, that are equally important to the functioning of modern society, even if it doesn't always seem obviously so. And those infrastructures are decidedly not falling apart. In fact, they're improving, and in many ways they're thriving, precisely because of the care and attention they're given by people who are often told the work they do is small or maybe niche. Although to the speakers of languages whose writing systems are still being encoded, such characterizations probably ring false. And what's more, the small infrastructures underlying letters and characters are always linked, often really literally linked, to the larger physical and social infrastructures we tend to treat as holding all of the power. And as the larger infrastructures decay, it's often the letters that persist. Last summer, for example, when subway stations in New York began flooding in the wake of Tropical Storm Ida, the subway system's iconic lettering could be seen surveying the ongoing disaster. Indeed, in almost any case of infrastructural collapse, we often find letters living on. So by way of concluding, and since this is all super preliminary still, I'll just end with a couple of thoughts. I use this distinction between small infrastructures and large infrastructures, mostly because the word infrastructure tends to invoke very specific imagery that leaves out important forms like letters and the code that supports them. I know this big and tiny dichotomy is imperfect, but perhaps that imperfection can push us to think more deeply about how letters and characters function as social and technical infrastructures that aren't separate from, but are of a piece with, the ones that we treat as supporting modern society. And finally, for Unicode folks and others who work with graphic language, loving letters is in fact a way of loving the world. Caring for writing means making sure that language can take a social form, many social forms actually, and in so doing provides a means for humans to build relations with each other, for better or for worse, but from my view, hopefully for the better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. What a beautiful presentation. So I am up next. And if you haven't guessed already, we're going to hold questions until the end of the 4 presentations, although you are welcome at any point to add questions or comments to the Q&A chat box. So my presentation is entitled Bridge Over Troubled Waters, the Script Encoding Initiative as an Intermediary Between Unicode and Digitally Disadvantaged Language Communities. So let me see if I can play this for you. And I think as I start my presentation, I'd also like to thank one of the invisible caretakers of language, the person who helped me design my slides, a student at Columbia, Eva Swain Loomis. And you know, this work, if I started thanking people, this work would, or this talk would just extend on and on, but there's so many people to thank, including some of the people here in the audience with us today, who have really informed my work and contributed in so many ways to it. So this presentation primarily draws on interviews, archival research, and observation of Unicode and ISO Subcommittee 2 Working Group 2 on character encoding, conducted for my dissertation, Digitizing Ethiopic, Coding for Linguistic Continuity in the Face of Digital Extinction. And here you see the Ethiopic script, which also known as the Ge'ez script or as the Fidel, within many of the languages that use this script in Ethiopia and Eritrea in East Africa. This presentation also draws on learnings from the Mellon Sawyer seminar in global language justice that I helped lead as a postdoc at Columbia University's Institute for Comparative Literature and Society from 2017 to 2019, including moderating presentations by Dr. Deborah Anderson of the Script Encoding Initiative. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the things that I've learned about their work over the last few years. And I think it's important to share these as a model of really trusted intermediary role that can work between the individuals and the communities that are using technology and the technical infrastructure and governments and corporate entities who are the ones who often are enabling the usefulness of this technology for the user communities. So Unicode's mission is that everyone in the world should be able to use their own language on phones and computers. And I think we've had a good introduction to Unicode. I'm just going to briefly touch on a few points. This is a nonprofit made up of, as Keith would say, you know, many companies that you have heard of, many of them based in Silicon Valley, as well as a few governmental and nonprofit members. While Unicode has gained quite a bit of journalistic kind of fame based on the encoding of emoji, it has actually been working for 3 decades on minority, historical, and indigenous scripts from across the globe. And it also coordinates with ISO and keeps and makes sure that script encoding proposals are approved not only on the side of Unicode, but also on the side of ISO, which whereas we see more of the corporate kind of representation on Unicode, you see representatives of nation states as the primary players within the ISO realm. And so they also have a chance to basically approve or deny kind of the encoding of character sets. And it's been a very, you know, a lot of work to keep these standards in sync, Unicode and the ISO IEC 10646 standard. And there's a lot of work done by the Script Encoding Initiative to work between these 2 entities. So I'm going to investigate 2 pressing questions in my presentation today. The first is the question of how user communities for digitally disadvantaged scripts who often lack economic and political voice, as well as technical expertise in the digital realm, how can they encode their script in Unicode? And this pressing question was the kind of driving force behind the Script Encoding Initiative, which was founded by Dr. Deborah Anderson in 2002. SEI is devoted to the preparation of formal proposals for the encoding of minority and historical scripts and script elements that are not yet currently supported in Unicode, as well as its sister ISO standard. SEI acts as a human face and an expert guide through the complex technical process. So I like to think of it as a bridge. SEI channels academic expertise, networks, and funding to make their work possible. It's based at the University of California, Berkeley. So it uses the kind of academic networks within the university, as well as through Dr. Anderson's relationship with linguists in many academic institutions to inform the script proposals that they develop. And UC Berkeley is the only university currently that is a full or institutional member of Unicode, as well as a liaison member of ISO Subcommittee 2, Working Group 2 on Character Encoding. Dr. Anderson also leads Unicode Script Ad Hoc Committee, which was mentioned in Keith's presentation. And funding has come historically from the National Endowment for the Humanities, UNESCO, and Unicode's Adopt a Character project. And this project primarily has kind of used the excitement around emoji to basically open up an opportunity for people to adopt a character, often an emoji, and you know, kind of sponsor that character. And the funds that are garnered from those efforts are then given to or used in the efforts of the Script Encoding Initiative to help support the encoding of minority and historical scripts. To date, SEI has helped encode over 70 scripts in Unicode, and I've sharing a few of them here with you. But as Anshuman shared, more than 100 scripts remain on SEI's roadmap yet to be encoded. And this, you know, thanks to these Neographies, as well as the discovery of historical scripts at times, you know, that have been kind of unearthed, this roadmap continues to grow. So what does this roadmap include? Well, it includes many minority scripts being used in parts of South and Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And we see Neographies popping up around the world, in fact. And, you know, as Anshu said, you know, often we see this as part of a kind of post-colonial wave of communities looking for ways to differentiate themselves from scripts that have often been imposed on them, as well as kind of differentiating themselves from communities around them. And so we have, for example, the unencoded scripts, Capel and Loma. Some scripts of historical significance still need to be encoded, like Book Pahlavi, Large Khitan, and Jerkin. And even major modern scripts have historical issues worth addressing. For example, the encoding model for Chinese continues to be refined. And as Anshu shared, there are new scripts being developed around the world that will require encoding support over time. So I want to share with you a little bit of about SEI's trusted intermediary approach. So first, very important point is that SEI waits for script communities to reach out to them. And this is very important because it's a way of fostering trust and can be a way of basically addressing communities' concerns about Unicode as kind of the face of corporate ownership of their script and language. And Dr. Anderson shared with me that when she was the one in the past to reach out to communities, often those concerns were at the forefront because there was a sense that, you know, in communities that have often faced impositions such as colonialism, that this would be one more effort to kind of take something from them, extract a part of their culture or language. Whereas when a script community, through their own engagement with digital technology, understands the importance and the, you know, the role that Unicode can play in helping them achieve the goals that they care about, then when they reach out to Script Encoding Initiative, it becomes a much more, you know, community-driven and fruitful engagement. And SEI also, I think this is kind of correlates with some of the themes that Keith was raising about these kind of these invisible caretakers, and also the very human kind of love of language that is behind this infrastructure that we so often take for granted. You know, SEI has found that it's really important to have face-to-face meetings in a community's locale whenever possible, and that it's really the human relationships and you know, face-to-face communication that builds the trust and actually pushes these kinds of very technical projects forward. And furthermore, it's important for SEI to create realistic expectations about what can be gained from encoding, including the timeline and the further work that will be needed even once a script is in Unicode. So, you know, Anshu mentioned a script that took 10 years or more for encoding, and this is not uncommon. And so often communities come in with a bit of an unrealistic expectation of how quickly this process can move forward. And also not always an understanding that, you know, having a script in Unicode, as we saw on one of Anshu's slides, just because it's in Unicode doesn't necessarily mean it's supported by Microsoft or, you know, the Android phone. So it needs to be supported at multiple levels that in technology circles are called full stack support. SEI also helps to resolve disagreements between different script stakeholders at times. So for example, sometimes a script might be used by two communities that may be separated by a national border, or maybe you know, different kinds of stakeholders within a community who have different views on you know, the rules of a script that may not be fully standardized. Furthermore, the SEI conducts research on the script to develop an accurate proposal, and this is done with script experts, often in the user community, sometimes within academic networks. And they ensure that user communities' concerns are represented at closed technical meetings. So they're a conduit for those concerns to be raised, but they also go beyond that to facilitate users' attendance at closed technical meetings. And this can be quite a challenge at times in terms of overcoming bureaucratic barriers, rules, or even financial barriers that would otherwise prevent users to attend meetings that are really, you know, designed for members only kind of participation, be it at Unicode or be it at the level of ISO, which in particular has kind of stricter rules about who can participate and attend meetings. And they may also quietly lobby ISO government representatives to approve proposals by minority groups within their borders. Sometimes governments are not too excited about a minority group having the capacity to digitally communicate in their language. And so, you know, there's a lot of kind of basically kind of mediation, conflict resolution, and kind of justice approaches that are used, again, at a very human-to-human level by SEI. Post-encoding, SEI also works to connect advocates to localization and internationalization desks at big tech companies to continue the work of supporting scripts. So, you know, at the level of software, at the level of keyboards and input, etc. Dr. Anderson says that each script has its own story, and SEI works to address, you know, each script's unique issues. And this is very much, you know, a kind of unique process for each example. So sometimes it might be encoding issues that are unique to complex scripts. It might be addressing political tensions around the naming of a script in the standards, which must fit ISO rules. So we're taking, you know, we're taking scripts that might be used by different communities with different names, and then you have to change that name into something written in Latin characters with no punctuation. And so, you know, within my research on Ethiopic, there was a lot of conversation about what the script should be called. Similarly with Old Hungarian, this took, it actually cost years and even a decade of time to resolve the issue of naming, which in the meantime can hold back the digital use of the characters. So it's very important to resolve those issues as kind of smoothly as possible. SEI can also help navigate closed or bureaucratic systems to facilitate community members' attendance of technical meetings due to national pride or concerns over ownership of the script. It's important for people to, who may have concerns about kind of corporate appropriation of their script to actually attend these, Unicode technical committee meeting, for example, to understand the context in which their script is being discussed, even if they may not understand, all of the technicalities around that process. And they also might, SEI may also ameliorate lack of government support for the encoding of a minority community script due to political repression. In short, SEI facilitates a technical process through systems marked by corporate, government, and user community power through the very human methods of building trust and relationships. The second pressing question that I explore here, how might the script encoding initiative's trusted intermediary approach provide a model for other digital governance institutions serving stakeholders who lack power, access, or expertise to directly influence decision-making? So Unicode and the ISO Subcommittee 2 Working Group 2 on character encoding are not the only spaces of digital governance. There are other institutions that similarly are marked by historical power dynamics. They may be kind of skewed towards, they're often skewed towards, the global north, wealthier countries, places where, digital development has been speedy and not so effectively representing the voices and interests of communities who are not present in those spheres. And and this is where we need to continue to work towards equity in these spaces, and in some cases a trusted intermediary approach can be I think a useful model. So I would call these a couple ways of thinking about this. One is good relations. A model may be useful in bridging other digital governance institutions, such as ICANN, IETF, etc. And it can be a model where expanded to advocate for and bridge the interests of language and script communities with big tech companies, government agencies, research communities, etc. And I think there's a role for intermediaries to be playing, both in advocacy as well as kind of a connecting role to the needs of user communities, connecting these different entities to experts who can also inform the tools that are developed on behalf of user communities. So considering that close to 2/3 of humanity is online and more digitally disadvantaged language speakers join every day, it is important that we build language equity into our tools, and trusted intermediaries like SEI provide a model for bridging the needs of diverse communities with techno-economic spheres that might otherwise be out of reach and or disinterested in their needs. So thank you to all the work that has influenced my, my research over the years. And I'll stop there and introduce our next speaker, Anushah Hossain, who, if she has not changed her title, may be presenting the, yes, digitizing index scripts, the gap between characters and glyphs.
Awesome, thank you, Isabelle. Okay, just getting set up. Okay, so hi everyone. Today I'm going to be recounting a story that illustrates how the Unicode Standard serves different communities, and in particular the index script communities. Like Anshu mentioned, index scripts are those that were descended from the ancient Brahmi script and are used throughout South and Southeast Asia. I'm also stepping back in history just a tiny bit to the early 2000s, which is eons ago in the internet years, when digital language support was still being developed, and Unicode in particular was still iterating on its encoding philosophies. So I think that'll come through in the case. So I'm going to be sharing the story of a rather fraught case of a letter from the Bangla alphabet, which is one of these index scripts, that was thought to be missing from the standard and led to a multi-year debate between the Bangla language community and members of the Unicode Consortium. until it was finally encoded in 2005. And that's the letter Kandata circled there. What I hope to convey to you by the end of this talk is that the Unicode standard hasn't existed in a vacuum. It was born of a certain historical moment, and the decisions made then have had implications for how other technologies interact with the standard, kind of like what Isabelle was mentioning about full stack language enablement, and how its design has affected the ease with which language communities can use their writing systems online. So I'll spend a few minutes now just going through this case. So it began in mid-2000 when the first email was sent out to the public Unicode mailing list about a perceived to be missing letter from the Bangla alphabet, Kandata. You can see a picture of it there. That first thread led to 20 emails exchanged back and forth, mostly between random subscribers to this mailing list, even though there were Unicode affiliated folks also subscribed. The issue was not resolved then and faded from view for a couple years. In 2002, it resurfaced again, leading to long email exchanges back and forth, and this time drawing in a Microsoft representative who explained how to display Kandata using a combination of existing code points and supplying language for Unicode's FAQ on the website, since there had now been several questions about this thought to be missing letter.
Anushah, can I, sorry, interrupt. I think your slides are not progressing.
Oh, really? Oh, okay, let me try sharing again.
Okay.
I'm using Google Slides, hopefully. Are you seeing a different page?
It says, what were the stakes involved?
Okay, so the things that you missed, this was the first email, many emails after that, more emails after that, and then the FAQ. Okay, thanks for letting me know as well. So, okay, you can still see, right?
Yes.
Okay, just checking. Thanks. So before I explain what was actually going on in those email threads, why there even needed to be this long conversation, I'm going to back up a bit and provide some historical and technical context. So just for reference, this issue with Kandata is not unique. Encoding debates like this have occurred regularly throughout Unicode's history as the standard has evolved and expanded. But the Bangla alphabet provides a really interesting window into the limits and stakes associated with Unicode. And that's because of its specific structure and history. So structurally, the Bangla script is part of the Indic script family and falls into a category that's been termed by software engineers as complex scripts. This category includes Indic scripts and Arabic scripts and encompasses language communities numbering in the billions. In Bangla and other Indic scripts, this is what the meaning of complex script is: the visual representation of a letter, or the glyph, as you've heard some folks talk about today, varies depending on what other letters are next to it. So in this example, the Bangla letter Ra, so that's a unit of the alphabet, can appear in these three different ways depending on what consonant is next to it and what part of the word the letter is appearing in. As Anshu explained, Unicode only handles characters, not these different glyphs. So for complex scripts where there's this big gap between the character and the glyph, Unicode says that other technologies need to handle storing and displaying the right glyph. Of this kind of category of complex scripts, Bangla is particularly complex because letters can appear in a lot of difficult combinations and stack vertically on either side of letters. So it's a challenging programming task. Politically, the Bangla language is laden with a lot of significance because it was the major reason for the Liberation War in 1971 that separated the modern-day country of Bangladesh from Pakistan. Linguistic, political, and economic oppression led to a bloody war that led to the deaths of several relatives of folks who are alive today, including those who were subscribing to the Unicode mailing list. This political history hangs in the backdrop of this particular case and resonated with both Bangladeshi and Indian, in particular West Bengali users. So with this context, let's return to what was being passed along in the messages of the Unicode listserv. On one hand, it seemed like what was socially recognized as a letter of the alphabet by Bengalis was being dismissed by mostly Western tech folks. Kandata was listed in dictionaries as a separate letter, as in this clip that's shown on the screen, and was needed to spell certain words. For the Bangla user community, the linguistic status felt unambiguous. Though Kandata was initially a graphical variant, is it the screen showing?
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, it's still saying what were the stakes involved.
Oh no. Okay.
And I know you have beautiful slides, so I hate to have
Don't
people.
worry. Let me restart the presentation. Sorry, I think that's what happens when you leave it up ready to go too early. Maybe the computer just forgets about it. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna try one more time. I think you're seeing the first screen.
Yes.
Okay, and let me move along to. Okay, so those are pictures of the Bangla script and a little bit about deliberation more. And that's a clip from a dictionary that shows two different letters. I think I was here. So I'll say for the Bangla user community, the linguistic status of Kandata on the right felt unambiguous. Though it was initially a graphical variant of tha, so kind of like the different ways you saw the letter A in the Latin script, Kandata had evolved into its own position of the alphabet and was distinguished from tha on the left, much in the way that U and V are distinguished today in the Latin alphabet, despite a similar history. The response given to this was that Kandata was not semantically unique as a character defined by Unicode, and that meant that this was the job of the font designer to include it as a glyph variant. And for the rendering engine and layout software, these are different upper level tools to figure out when to display what. So this is kind of what those upper level tools do. One step is called the rendering engine. And note that these are technologies that sit within operating systems and software applications to deal with text. There are open source ones, but also Microsoft, Adobe, Apple, other companies use specific ones that are more opaque to users. And they have this big task of rearranging and repositioning all the glyphs. Are the screens still moving ahead?
You're good.
Okay. So the rendering by Microsoft in particular was buggy and became worse after that FAQ was updated in 2002, meaning that something needed to be fixed. Kandata would not consistently appear in the right order within words because of how Microsoft software handled the combination of code points. So there are blog posts like this clip shown here that were being passed around. And the political weight associated with the Bangla language meant that there were several fervent supporters for whom this decision was nothing short of saving Bangla in the digital age. This is a quote from one of the people who were posting on the email threads. We're the only language that fought for our language and shed blood. We looked into the Unicode situation because otherwise Bangla would die. It's very high stakes. Between 2002 and 2004, the Kandata debate would continue in circles on Unicode mailing lists, but would start to bring in more powerful actors, from the Bangladesh Standards Institution to India's Ministry of ICT, to impassioned Bangla linguists and open source hobbyists who were seeking to build Bangla software because it felt like nobody else would. You might ask here why Unicode was digging its heels around this character versus glyph distinction, even though it felt kind of fuzzy. So I'll provide some backstory here of where this design principle came from. I argue that this policy was born out of the landscape of globalization in the late 1980s when Unicode was being developed. The major commercial targets were North American and European countries, most of whom use the Latin alphabet, for which there is hardly a need to distinguish between characters and glyphs. So this is a quote from one of the founders of the Unicode Standard that recognized how easy Latin alphabets were to work with. And the other equally important market was in East Asia, where the writing systems had so many letters, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, that Unicode developed what it called Han Unification, which is distilling the many shared semantic units between different East Asian languages, like Chinese or Korean or Japanese, into just their single form. So in this example here, you have 5 different visual representations for the same word. And Unicode said it would only encode that word and leave it up to the font designer to work with all of these different visuals. This was controversial enough for the East Asian scripts, but it also has implications for complex scripts in South Asia and in the Middle East. This rule was important because it allowed Unicode to fit the most commercially important characters into a single 16-bit standard, which was perceived in 1988 as the optimal size for computers to then handle. So you can see this is from one of the scoping documents where the founders literally lay out, okay, these are the scripts that are most important for the software industry. And of course, Devanagari and Arabic are only a small percentage of world GNP. So in some ways, I think this part of the history highlights that Unicode's design was not really made with index scripts in mind. For these complex scripts, the character is not glyphs policy adds complexity not only for the font designer, as with the East Asian scripts, but creates this expectation for other rendering and layout technologies, which had not been invented at the time, to do the rearranging and substitution that's so essential and is this very difficult programming task. There is also one other dynamic in place, which explained why Conducta wasn't included in the first place. When Unicode was first released, it sought to bring in every existing standard into its folds, which included ASCII, which is a very popular one coming out of America, and also ISCII, which was India's national standard. ISCII is pretty interesting. It included the major scripts of India, including Bangla, but was somewhat controversial because it was never really implemented. It was just kind of an idea that came out of research universities and was promoted by the Indian government. And it was controversial in particular because of its somewhat Devanagari-centric design. So all the other scripts, major scripts of India, were lined up against the Devanagari model in the first column, and idiosyncrasies of these other scripts, like Conducta, which is specific to Bangla, were left out. Part of Unicode's pushback was their falling back on ISCII. ISCII was supposed to be from the experts, so if Conducta wasn't in there, that must mean something. This kind of cultural ignorance on the Unicode side is readily admitted to by many of the folks who before argued against Conducta in modern day interviews. The rendering engineer said, oh, I went with it because I thought it was right. I want to highlight that point in particular because we often use this frame of the West versus global South, but this is kind of incomplete because of the regional dynamics in South Asia that are relevant to the story. There are language politics in which Hindi and thereby the Devanagari script were promoted for much of the 20th century until grassroots activism and pushback kind of elevated these other scripts and created a more multilingual language planning scheme. So we often say ASCII imperialism in the science and technology studies literature, but you might also think about ISCII imperialism. So I've done a lot of backstory and I'm close to wrapping up. How was the issue eventually resolved? In truth, it was years of advocacy and endless email threads that led to a Microsoft representative eventually championing this issue and bringing it to the Unicode Technical Committee to say Conducta needed to be encoded. As he said in a recent interview, he went in there and said this issue is not going to go away. And the documents published afterwards suggest that this diplomatic kind of economic angle of not losing the goodwill of the Indian people was important. From a technical perspective, Conducta was demonstrably buggy at the least, and the decision to encode it was the point at which the tide began to turn with respect to complex scripts. Unicode began to handle them a bit more at the encoding layer rather than kind of pushing up the complications to rendering software. A stream of similar fixes were made in the ensuing years, especially for the idiosyncrasies of index scripts that were not Devanagari. As one staffer said more recently, if we got Conducta today, we would encode it without a blink of an eye. So I think in the end, what the story demonstrates is the complex politics and history of the Unicode standard, what legacies and commercial interests have shaped it, and what the implications are for users today, particularly for index script communities. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anushah. So we've had such a I've so much enjoyed listening to the talks, and I hope the same has been true for all of our audience members. We'd love to take your questions. I think unless Sarah Monks with ITLS steers me differently, I think the best way to share those is through the Q&A. And then as a moderator, I'm happy to read those out, and whoever is able to respond will respond. And while we wait for questions through the Q&A, do any of the presenters have a question for another presenter?
Anshuman, I actually had a question. How did you move from history into this?
It was it's actually the other way around. I've always had a really strong passion for writing systems and for doing research on writing systems. And I chose history as the vehicle to conduct those investigations, primarily from a paleographical and epigraphical standpoint. Then once I got into grad school, I got diverted and confused by the lure of the academic market. So started studying social structures and other things, but my love has always been writing systems, and I've always had a technical background as well. And then being able to combine those and find the home for that unified interest within Unicode has always been, has been just a really extraordinary experience and an outcome. I mean, I'd like to ask the other Keith and Anushah as well. Like, as you've been doing research on Unicode and its role in language representation, both linguistically and also orthographically, what are your impressions of the standard and its importance to the digital sphere, apart from the academic critiques and the theoretical investigations that you've done?
I can talk a bit about, like, I focus mostly on South Asia, and I think Unicode is obviously important for every script in the world. It's kind of that first step without which no exchange can happen. Like, one point that's very important that we sometimes forget is that you can display text on computers without Unicode, but if you want to share it with somebody else, then you really need the standard, and that's kind of one of the big things that Unicode lets us do. But for South Asian scripts, and for some others, it doesn't end there. Like, rendering and layout is so important, and that is not standardized. I think there's cooperation, obviously, between companies, but the whole process is much more opaque, and it lags behind. So I think it's really useful to think about, like, the whole stack and how all of these tools need to cooperate with each other. So that's something that's been coming out more and more in my research.
Yeah, and as for me, like, I had originally, Unicode hadn't been a part of my conceptualization of my research project, which was mostly on fonts and typography. Basically, until I talked to Kamal Mansour, who was like, "You really should think about Unicode," and I'm like, "Yeah, maybe I should think about Unicode." And it kind of instantly became the most one of the most interesting parts of my overall project, and really added a whole bunch of questions and robust areas to dive into, partly because most of my own research thus far has been on spoken language, trained as a linguistic anthropologist, but then kind of looking at it's not, Unicode is about writing, but it's not really about writing. It's about a bunch of other things. And that became, it opened up a whole bunch of perspectives that I hadn't really considered as either an anthropologist or a linguist. But then kind of looking at the complexity of it, and that it's like, I part of this talk, I had originally written stuff about like there are critiques of Unicode and all that kind of stuff, which of course there are, and I just for time's sake mostly just didn't include some of that in here. But the complexity of what Unicode is as an infrastructure, but also as a group of humans that are trying to do things, is I could just write my whole book on that. It's not this will probably just be a small part of it, or not a small part of it, like one of the 3 or 4 main parts of it. But I should probably just write the whole book on it.
Yeah, thanks for those responses. I mean, I'm really happy to hear that there's a a breadth to the interest in Unicode within an academic framework. And I've often thought about either writing a history of the standard, Unicode Standard, and the consortium, or let's say more doable would be like an edited volume on academic interrogations of Unicode through process and practice. I mean, which is a kind of a working title for something that I have. But maybe we can encourage more scholars to do work in this area, and we can get enough chapters to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Anushah and Isabelle and I have, I mean, we kind of, Debbie is kind of the connector, and I think in a lot of cases, if you're still on the call, thank you, Debbie. But it's actually a little bit surprising that more people haven't sort of looked at Unicode prior to the last few years, and maybe they have and we just aren't aware of it, but I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously there's lots of scholarly people within Unicode, but I'm an outsider, Anushah is an outsider, Isabelle is an outsider, and so we're sort of coming and we kind of become insiders in a particular way, although I try to keep my anthropological distance as much as I can. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what is about the current moment that we all sort of drifted there, but interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think this panel came out of this sort of convergence of interest, and I do hope that it grows into something, maybe a book, as you said, Anshu. And I think this panel, and let's see, Anushah, Keith, and I, and Jonathan Soma presented also at the 4S conference back in the fall. And so we're kind of hopefully, growing a little bit of momentum in our interest in kind of creating, I don't know what you would say, shared interest, conversations, and where it may head, I don't know. But I think it's been, as somebody who's been studying Unicode since, I guess, 2015, or even 2014, it's really lovely to hear other people's reflections and see how those dovetail and also depart and bring new insight into, shared interests. So I also wanted to put, and maybe I'll just state this rather than put it into the chat, but one of my students who is attending this event today, Michel Guy, he recommended to me a book that I would recommend to all of you called Kingdom of Characters, The Language Revolution That Made China Modern by Jing Zhu. And I'll put it in the chat as well. And this is another scholar who has looked at the process of the ongoing and maybe possibly never ending work of encoding the Hanzi characters, and very fascinating scholarly take on this effort, and maybe somebody who could be part of the volume if that should ever come together. So I don't see any questions popping up in the chat. So
there was one, but it
there's
disappeared.
one in the Q&A.
I see it answered.
No,
Okay,
it's not answered. I just said it's a great question. Maybe we should address
okay. Yeah, perfect. So Kyra Ann Dawkins, so good to have you with us. The question is, I imagine that Unicode plays a huge role in making AI transcription in multiple scripts possible. For languages that have used multiple scripts, is choosing one script in a moment of transcription an inherently political act? And yeah, Anshu, would you like to comment more on that? I think your talk, you may have a good sense of, the technical side of this, and also, your presentation touched on this sort of the sense of a need, at least from Unicode side, to say which script are you choosing? What is the, this maybe the single kind of correct script for each community?
I mean, I think this is a great question, because it points to a lot of issues regarding AI transcription and like the technologies that would enable transcription. Now, for example, like if, let's say, there's multiple scripts for a given language, whether the script that's chosen at that particular moment is political is one question. But I think underlying that is, did the people who designed that platform account for the fact that a particular language has multiple scripts, and did they build support for those scripts into that framework? So let's say we are doing a transcription, and the transcription platform automatically selects a particular script for a given language. Now, somebody in the back end somewhere assigned that mapping, that you've detected language X through the particular sequence of phonemes, and this is the script that's being mapped to it. Some user or some analyst at Amazon or Microsoft or Google made that mapping. Now we're relying upon their understanding and their comprehension of the complexities of orthography and language for that given speech, that language. So if we were to consider that situation and say, oh, you know what, I am a Bangla speaker, and I wanted to see in Bangladesh, and I wanted to see my speech being transcribed in the Perso-Arabic alphabet, for example, rather than in the Bengali script, then I might say, oh my gosh, this platform is biased against me, and it's not taking into consideration my preference. Whereas the reality is that somebody just said, okay, languages like A and B are written in script X and Y. And it's a banality of consequence that is unintentional, but it leads to a particular outcome that may reflect in the speaker's point of view that there was some sort of malicious intent, right? But that may not be the case. So whether we consider something to be political all kind of depends on the framework in which we're operating. So in an ideal situation where we have a complete mapping of all languages and all the scripts that they're written in, then we can say, okay, then we say if a particular AI platform chooses script A for language X over script B, then that might be a political act. But if it's a matter of, let's say, technological malfeasance or technological ignorance, then whether that's political or not is up for debate. So I'm kind of not answering your question by giving you a roundabout answer.
I would say that it's definitely political, but but that's just like because of everything that Anshu said, but that like the politics is sort of embedded in the kind of way that these things get engineered. I mean, in an equitable sense would be like someone could go in, put a file for transcription or whatever it is, and say, this is the language, this is the script. And, but that's, again, a really complicated set of things that need to be designed into it. But we're still in the infant years of AI transcription anyway. But this is something that I've thought about a lot as well. What script gets chosen. I think everything that I've ever seen is only in Latin anyway. So I don't know whether others are available.
Yeah, I mean, like in an ideal situation, like let's say I'm a Hindi speaker in Agra, and there's a Hindustani element to speech transcription, and I use a set of Perso-Arabic words, or I use Sanskritic words in my parlance. I would not expect the AI platform to be able to switch to a particular script based on the lexicon that I'm using. What I would expect is that there be a configuration in the preferences or settings of that app that would enable the user to say, this is my predominant language and this is the script that I choose, and then to have, let's say, script A and script D. And it would be a drop-down menu so that the user would know that these are the scripts that are available to you for a given language. So at least that layer of transparency is readily available to a user, and that would cut out any sort of suspicion. And then there would be a note, you know, says, you know, if you have a request for additional scripts, you know, please leave a comment here within the app, right? So you have an in-app comment, and then there would be kind of ideally a feedback loop back to the app developer or to the software company.
Great. Well, thank you for the comments on that. I think with that, we should wrap up our event. I want to again thank the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and especially the Assistant Director, Sarah Monks, who has been with us facilitating this talk today, as well as Director Anupama Rao, who also does so much to make the center really just a hotbed of exciting and very, you know, cross-cultural, cross-lingual, and cross-disciplinary conversation. And also to name our co-sponsors, the Columbia Data Science Institute, the Script Encoding Initiative, and the Department of Linguistics at University of California, Berkeley, and the Center for Ethnography at University of California, Irvine. And last, just thank you to the panelists and to our guests for attending. And I hope you enjoyed the event as much as I did. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. It was great.
Thanks.
And thanks to all of the sponsors and everyone there in New York. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone.